Hi guys, Miss Francis here to talk to you about a very important topic regarding how cells communicate. Cell communication is found in every facet of biology and we'll retouch upon how cells communicate throughout the year. Think about all the different ways that you communicate. You can communicate verbally, non-verbally, with hand gestures, or with facial expressions. Maybe you send a text message or an email. Well, cells are the same way. They have multiple ways of communicating with one another. But in general, communication is going to go through transmission, reception, and a response to a signal. So here's an overview of cell communication. We're going to talk about three different types of cell communication. You've got short distance communication, long distance communication, and then direct or cell-to-cell communication. Two examples of short distance communication are neurotransmitters and yeast mating. Another example of short distance communication is quorum sensing. We covered neurotransmitters when we discussed the neuron. Yeast mating involves, obviously, the mating of yeast. Now, yeast can usually mate asexually, but they can mate sexually, where yeast will release pheromones and neighboring yeast will pick up. Their receptors will receive those pheromones and actually form what's called a shmoo, and that's known as yeast mating. Quorum sensing is short distance communication that occurs with bacteria where they release autoinducers, their chemical message. And once a certain proportion of these autoinducers relative to the bacteria exists, they're able to launch whatever task it might be. Maybe it's to attack a host, or maybe it's to turn on bioluminescence. Another type of communication is long-distance communication. Hormones are an example of long-distance communication. Believe it or not, hormones can be found in both animals and plants. In plants, they're called auxins. An example of a plant hormone is ethylene. Ethylene is a ripening hormone. Classic examples of animal hormones include ADH, insulin, adrenaline. ADH we already covered. Insulin and adrenaline we're actually going to look at in great length as we move along in our cell communication unit. Hormones can exhibit positive and negative feedback mechanisms. When you talk of a positive feedback mechanism, it means that I'm amplifying the response. So, for example, when a plant releases ethylene, it ripens that plant. When that plant ripens, it releases more ethylene. As I release more ethylene, the plant ripens even more. That's an example of positive feedback mechanisms where I'm amplifying, or where the signal amplifies. An example that you could find in humans is with oxytocin. Oxytocin is released when a woman is in labor, and it brings about contractions. As she has contractions, more oxytocin is released. As she releases the oxytocins, the more contractions come about. Then we have direct cell-to-cell communication. Plasmodesmata in plants are an example. Those are those gaps between neighboring plants where the chemical messages can diffuse from one plant cell to a neighboring plant cell. Immune cells in animals exhibit direct cell-to-cell communication, that antigen-antibody relationship. Viruses and hosts exhibit a direct or a cell-to-cell communication. There's also something called contact inhibition, which involves direct communication where one cell can recognize another cell using those glycoproteins, those oligosaccharides that are attached to the cell membrane. And cancer plays a role in the inability for contact inhibition to occur. As in other units, there are many ways to say the same thing. So local signaling can be called paracrine signaling. That would be like your short distance signaling. Synaptic signaling is the same as your neurotransmitters. Endocrine signaling is an example of long distance signaling where you have hormones that are traveling through your bloodstream. Here are some other examples: autocrine signaling, juxtacrine signaling, paracrine signaling, and again, that endocrine signaling. So basically, cell-to-cell communication is absolutely essential for multicellular organisms. We need to coordinate our activities in order to regulate and maintain homeostasis. Now, believe it or not, unicellular organisms must also communicate. It's also vital to their survival. And the basic chemical processes by which cells communicate are shared across evolutionary lines of descent. When you watch the Bonnie Bassler TED Talk, you'll see how she's able to connect how bacteria communicate to the communication pathways in organisms as complex as humans. So what do these chemical signals do? Well, they allow they allow cells to communicate without any physical contact, where the distance between the signaling generating cells can be small or can be large. And there's often a gradient response, meaning I can have a light response or a severe response, where I must pass threshold concentrations to trigger that communication pathway. And we saw that with the action potential. If I didn't go beyond that negative 55 millivolts, my action potential was not sent. Same holds true for communication. We did an activity called Pathway with Friends in class where we were able to identify the different parts of any communication pathway. This is an elaboration on the different types of communication and the examples of those different types. So hormones travel greater distances, therefore they're referred to long distance types of communication. For example, hormones like insulin, they are going to travel via the circulatory system. In other words, they're going to be released into blood vessels to travel to target cells. In plants, the hormones may travel in vessels, but more often than not, they diffuse through the air. For example, ethylene, which is a hormone that causes fruit to ripen, that also behaves as a positive feedback mechanism. Here is another example of a negative feedback mechanism, where I could have a growth hormone, for example, that stimulates some sort of growth factor that sends a signal back to the pituitary gland that inhibits that growth hormone from being released. The other classic example of negative feedback is insulin helping to return your body to homeostatic blood glucose levels. Mr. Anderson described positive feedback mechanisms as amplification, and he also used the ethylene example. An elaboration on neurotransmitters. We talked about these ad nauseum when we talked about neurons. The presynaptic membrane almost touches the postsynaptic membrane, but there is this little gap, the synapse or the synaptic cleft, by which the neurotransmitters must travel. Here's yeast mating, where yeast release pheromones. Those pheromones are recognized by neighboring yeast. A shmoo is formed, and now you've got yeast mating sexually. Other examples of communication include direct contact or cell-to-cell contact, like plasmodesmata in plants, or gap junctions that are found in animal cells. Immune cells, right? That antigen antibody response involves oligosaccharides on their surfaces. Other examples of direct cell-to-cell communication include the virus-host relationship, as well as contact inhibition. So when I have contact inhibition, adjacent cells are able to recognize those oligosaccharides on the neighboring cell and stops growing. However, if I have that loss of contact inhibition, the adjacent cells don't get the message and my cells don't stop growing. Here's just a little review question. What doesn't belong? Plasmodesmata, because that's an example of a structure used for communication. All the rest are involved in chemical signaling. Next, we're going to talk about the 3 stages of cell signaling, which we alluded to when we did our activity today.